Xi Jinping presented a four-point proposal to end the United States-Iran war after ceasefire negotiations in Islamabad collapsed, and Washington has chosen not to formally endorse that framework, despite acknowledging that Beijing may have influenced Iran's willingness to negotiate. Let me be precise about this. A proposal was not offered in isolation. It followed a failed diplomatic effort in Islamabad, where the United States delegation, led by Vice President J.D. Vance, and Iranian officials reached a point where Iran rejected American demands as unreasonable. That rejection is the immediate trigger, but the structure behind it is what matters. Here is what the proposal contains. 4 elements. First, a reaffirmation of national sovereignty. Second, adherence to what Beijing describes as a rules-based international order. Third, the immediate resumption of negotiations. Fourth, the protection of civilian populations from further military strikes. Each of these points is simple when stated individually. Taken together, they form a framework that reflects a very specific diplomatic logic. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. Most coverage treats this as a standard peace initiative. It is not. To understand why Beijing put forward this framework, you have to understand the sequence of decisions that led to it. The collapse of talks in Islamabad is not just a failed meeting. It is evidence of 2 negotiating positions that were structurally incompatible at that moment. Washington's position, as stated, includes permanent suspension of Iranian uranium enrichment and the complete dismantlement of all nuclear facilities. Iran's response, according to the record, was to reject those demands as unreasonable. That rejection is not just a negotiating tactic. It defines the boundary of what Tehran considers acceptable under current conditions. Now place China into this structure. China is not a neutral observer in the abstract sense. It is Iran's largest oil customer. That is a material fact. It creates a direct economic exposure to the continuation of the conflict. At the same time, China is positioning itself as an active diplomatic actor. Since the war began, Foreign Minister Wang Yi has conducted 26 separate phone calls with counterparts across the world. 26. That number is not symbolic. It reflects sustained diplomatic engagement across multiple channels. Think carefully about what that means. 26 calls is not reactive diplomacy. It is coordinated outreach. It indicates that Beijing is not only responding to events, but attempting to shape the diplomatic environment around them. There is a data point in this report that changes the structural picture entirely. We will get to it. Before that, consider the timing. The proposal emerges after failed talks, not before. That matters. It means Beijing is not trying to preempt a negotiation. It is stepping into a vacuum created by the breakdown of an existing one. This is not new. In multiple previous cases, major powers have entered diplomatic space only after the primary negotiating channel has stalled. The pattern is consistent. When one framework collapses, another actor introduces an alternative set of principles that reframes the discussion. The introduction of the 4-point plan fits that pattern precisely. Let me be very precise about this. The proposal is not detailed in terms of enforcement mechanisms or timelines. It is principle-based. That is a deliberate choice. Principle-based frameworks allow flexibility. They create room for interpretation. They avoid locking the proposing party into specific commitments. This is a known diplomatic method. Now consider Washington's response. There is no formal endorsement of the Chinese framework. At the same time, there is an acknowledgement from former President Donald Trump, in comments to AFP, that China may have played a role in encouraging Iran to come to the negotiating table during a brief ceasefire period. That acknowledgement is limited. It does not extend to acceptance of the framework itself. Washington calls this insufficient. Beijing calls it a starting point. The terminology tells you everything about why they cannot currently align. And this is the part of the report that almost no one is explaining accurately. At the same time as this diplomatic activity, another layer emerges. United States intelligence reports claim that China was preparing to deliver new air defense systems to Iran. The Chinese embassy in Washington has denied these claims completely, describing them as fabricated. This creates a second track in the narrative, one diplomatic, one security-related. These 2 tracks are not separate. They interact. If China is perceived as both a mediator and a potential supplier of military systems, the credibility of its diplomatic role becomes contested. If the claims are denied and rejected by Beijing, then the question shifts to information credibility and strategic messaging. Either way, the existence of this claim changes how Washington evaluates China's proposal. We have seen this exact dynamic before. One actor attempts to mediate while being simultaneously perceived as aligned with one side of the conflict. The result is a credibility gap that complicates the mediation effort. Now add one more layer. Xi Jinping is not operating in a single variable environment. Analysts describe a balancing act with 4 simultaneous pressures. Protecting China's oil supply from Iran, maintaining an image as a responsible global mediator, avoiding direct confrontation with the United States, preparing for a scheduled summit visit by Donald Trump to Beijing in May. 4 pressures. Each one pulls in a different direction. Consider the first. Iran, as the largest oil supplier to China, creates a direct economic incentive for stability. Disruption to that supply is not theoretical. It translates into immediate economic impact. Second, the image of a global mediator. This is not simply public relations. It reflects China's broader positioning in international diplomacy. Acting as a broker in a major conflict carries reputational implications. Third, avoiding direct confrontation with Washington. This constraint limits how far Beijing can go in either direction. Too close to Iran, and it risks escalation with the United States. Too distant, and it reduces its influence. Fourth, the upcoming summit. Diplomatic positioning ahead of a high-level meeting shapes behavior in advance. Decisions are not made in isolation from future engagements. Think about the interaction of these 4 pressures. They do not align naturally. They create tension within China's own decision-making process. And this brings us to the central analytical question. Is the 4-point proposal primarily a genuine attempt to end the conflict? Or is it a structured diplomatic instrument designed to manage multiple strategic constraints simultaneously? Every proposal reflects the constraints behind it. That is the line to hold here, because the proposal cannot be understood without understanding the constraints that produced it. And the constraints are not only external, they are internal to China's position in this conflict. Now we turn to the earlier data point, 26 diplomatic calls. That level of engagement indicates that Beijing is not treating this as a peripheral issue. It is central enough to require sustained attention across multiple counterparts. And this is where the structure becomes clear. A failed negotiation in Islamabad, a set of US demands rejected by Iran, a Chinese proposal introduced immediately after, diplomatic outreach at scale, parallel claims about military support denied, a balancing act across 4 strategic pressures, and a major bilateral summit approaching. This is not a random sequence of events. It is a chain. The question is not what the proposal says on paper. The question is what role it is designed to play within this chain of events. Because if the framework is not being endorsed by Washington, and if Iran has already rejected the core US demands, then the space between those positions remains unresolved. And that unresolved space is where the next stage of this situation will emerge. The Chinese 4-point proposal reveals less about what Beijing wants publicly, and more about how each actor in this situation is defining acceptable outcomes behind closed doors. Let me be precise about this. Diplomatic language often obscures intent, but the structure of the proposal, the timing of its release, and the responses to it allow us to reconstruct the underlying logic of each side with a high degree of clarity. Start with Beijing. China's 4 points, sovereignty, rules-based order, negotiations, civilian protection, are not random principles. Each one corresponds to a constraint China is currently managing. Sovereignty addresses Iran's core demand. A rules-based order speaks to international legitimacy. Negotiations create space for de-escalation. Civilian protection aligns with global expectations of responsible conduct. This is not what most people think it is. This is not a peace plan in the sense of a detailed roadmap. It is a diplomatic framework designed to be acceptable enough to multiple parties without committing Beijing to enforcement responsibilities. That distinction matters. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. Beijing is not trying to impose a solution. It is trying to keep the negotiation space open while protecting its own strategic interests. Those interests are clearly visible. China is Iran's largest oil customer. That is not a minor detail. It is the foundation of Beijing's exposure to this conflict. Continued war introduces direct risk to energy supply. That risk translates into domestic economic pressure. So stability is not optional from Beijing's perspective. It is necessary. At the same time, Beijing is attempting to present itself as a global mediator. This is where the 26 diplomatic calls by Foreign Minister Wang Yi become important. 26 calls indicate active positioning, not passive observation. Think carefully about what that means. Beijing is not waiting for outcomes. It is trying to shape them, but within limits. Now consider those limits. China is also managing its relationship with Washington. There is a scheduled summit between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump in May. That upcoming meeting creates a boundary condition. Beijing cannot act in a way that would trigger direct confrontation with the United States ahead of that engagement. So the logic becomes clear. China needs stability in Iran for energy reasons. It wants to be seen as a responsible mediator. It cannot escalate tensions with Washington, and it must prepare for a high-level diplomatic meeting. 4 constraints, 1 framework. Let me be very precise about this. The 4-point proposal is the output of those constraints. It is not an abstract moral position. It is a structured response to a multivariable problem. Now shift to Washington. The United States' position is defined by its demands: permanent suspension of Iranian uranium enrichment and complete dismantlement of all nuclear facilities. These are not incremental demands, they are maximalist in nature. They define an end state rather than a negotiating midpoint. And this is where the structural friction emerges. Iran has already rejected these demands as unreasonable. That rejection establishes a boundary. If Washington maintains these conditions as non-negotiable and Iran maintains its rejection, then the negotiation space collapses. This was visible in Islamabad. Talks did not fail randomly. They failed because the positions presented were incompatible at that stage. Washington reads this as necessary pressure. Iran reads it as unacceptable constraint. Both readings follow internal logic. The problem is that both logics, operating at the same time, eliminate overlap. We have seen this exact dynamic before. Negotiations break down not because communication fails, but because the acceptable outcome for each side does not intersect. Now introduce Beijing into this structure again. China's proposal does not address the specific U.S. demands directly. It avoids them. Instead, it recenters the discussion on principles that allow talks to resume without requiring immediate agreement on those demands. This is a deliberate move. By shifting the framework from outcomes to principles, Beijing creates a pathway back to negotiation without forcing either side to concede its stated position up front. But here is the critical point. Washington has not endorsed this framework. That decision is not procedural, it is strategic. By not endorsing the Chinese proposal, Washington maintains control over the negotiation parameters. Accepting the framework would mean entering a process defined, at least partially, by Beijing. Rejecting or ignoring it keeps the United States in a position where it defines the conditions for engagement. And this is the part of the report that almost no one in Western media is explaining accurately. The issue is not whether the proposal is reasonable. The issue is who sets the terms of negotiation. Now consider the statement by Donald Trump. He acknowledged that China may have helped push Iran toward the negotiating table during the brief ceasefire period. That acknowledgement is limited but important. It indicates that Washington recognizes Beijing's influence over Tehran, at least to some degree. But recognition of influence does not translate into acceptance of leadership. Let me be very precise about this. Washington can acknowledge China's role in facilitating talks while still rejecting China's role in structuring those talks. Those are two different levels of involvement. Now introduce the second track, the intelligence claims. U.S. intelligence reports suggest that China was preparing to deliver new air defense systems to Iran. The Chinese embassy in Washington has denied these claims completely, calling them fabricated. This creates a credibility divide. If Washington believes these reports, then China is not a neutral mediator. It is a participant with material alignment to one side. If Beijing's denial is accepted, then the reports themselves become part of the strategic narrative, rather than an operational reality. Either way, the effect is the same. It complicates China's position. And this is where the structural logic becomes clear. Beijing is attempting to operate simultaneously as a mediator and as a state with direct economic ties to one party in the conflict. Washington is maintaining maximalist demands while resisting a framework proposed by a competing major power. Iran has rejected those demands and remains within its own defined boundaries. 3 actors, 3 logics, limited overlap. There is a data point in this report that changes the structural picture entirely. We return to it now. 26 diplomatic calls. That number is not just activity, it is evidence of network building. Beijing is engaging multiple countries, not just the primary actors in the conflict. That suggests an attempt to shape broader international perception and potentially build support for its framework. This is not new. Major powers often expand diplomatic engagement beyond the immediate conflict to create a wider base of legitimacy for their proposals. Now step back. Washington is focused on outcomes, specific, defined, and non-negotiable at this stage. Beijing is focused on process, reopening negotiations under a flexible framework. Iran is focused on rejecting what it considers unacceptable constraints. These are 3 different approaches to the same problem. Washington calls this enforcement, Beijing calls this stabilization, Iran calls this resistance. The terminology tells you everything about why alignment is currently absent. And this leads directly to the structural consequence that must be addressed. If one actor insists on fixed outcomes, another insists on flexible process, and a third rejects the fixed outcomes entirely, then the negotiation space does not expand, it contracts. Miscalculation requires no malice, only different risk thresholds. That is the line to hold here. Because each side is operating within its own definition of acceptable risk, and those definitions are not aligned. The United States risks prolonged conflict to achieve its stated objectives. Iran risks continued pressure to avoid those objectives. China risks reputational and strategic cost to keep the process open. 3 risk calculations, no shared baseline. And this brings us to the structural question that now defines the situation. If the current positions remain unchanged, if Washington does not adjust its demands, if Iran does not revise its rejection, and if China's framework remains unendorsed, Then what mechanism exists to bring these positions back into alignment? Because without that mechanism, the structure does not produce resolution, it produces continuation. The current trajectory is defined by three positions that do not intersect, and a fourth actor attempting to prevent that lack of intersection from becoming irreversible. Let me be precise about this. The evidence shows a structure in which the United States is holding to fixed demands. Iran has rejected those demands as unreasonable, and China has introduced a framework designed to reopen negotiations without resolving those demands at the outset. That structure does not contain an internal mechanism for convergence. This is not a crisis in the sense of being sudden or unpredictable. It is the visible result of positions that have been clarified through action. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. The issue is not whether a peace plan exists. A plan has been presented. The issue is whether the actors involved are operating within a shared framework that allows that plan to function. At this moment, they are not. China's proposal is built on principles that are intentionally broad: sovereignty, rules-based order, negotiations, civilian protection. These principles create a structure in which talks can resume without requiring immediate agreement on contested issues. Washington's position is built on specific conditions: permanent suspension of uranium enrichment, complete dismantlement of nuclear facilities. These conditions define a final state rather than a starting point. Iran's position, as demonstrated in Islamabad, is a rejection of those conditions as unreasonable. These are not variations of the same approach. They are different categories of approach. Let me be very precise about this. When one side defines success as the achievement of fixed conditions, and another defines success as the reopening of process without those conditions, and a third rejects the conditions entirely, the system does not self-correct. It stabilizes in disagreement. And this is the pattern, not just in this case, in every case where negotiation frameworks and outcome frameworks are misaligned. The structure itself prevents resolution. Now consider China's position within this structure. Beijing is attempting to maintain four simultaneous objectives: protecting its oil supply from Iran, preserving its role as a responsible mediator, avoiding direct confrontation with Washington, preparing for a high-level summit with Donald Trump in May. Each of these objectives imposes a constraint. Protecting oil supply requires stability. Acting as a mediator requires perceived neutrality. Avoiding confrontation requires limiting alignment with Iran. Preparing for the summit requires managing relations with Washington. These constraints do not align naturally. Think carefully about what that means. China cannot fully satisfy all four simultaneously. Any movement toward one objective creates pressure on the others. And this is where the structural tension within Beijing's approach becomes visible. If China leans too far into mediation, it risks being seen by Washington as attempting to reshape the negotiation framework. If it leans too far into its economic relationship with Iran, it risks undermining its credibility as a neutral actor. If it pulls back to avoid confrontation, it reduces its influence over the situation. If it prioritizes the upcoming summit, it may limit its flexibility in the present moment. This is not a position of control, it is a position of constrained influence. And this is the part of the report that almost no one is explaining accurately. China is active, it is engaged, it is making calls, presenting frameworks, positioning itself diplomatically, but activity is not the same as control over outcomes. Now return to Washington. By not endorsing the Chinese framework, the United States is maintaining its ability to define the terms of engagement. That decision preserves strategic autonomy. It also narrows the available pathways for immediate negotiation. This is a trade-off. Maintaining control over negotiation terms increases clarity of objectives. It also reduces flexibility in how those objectives can be pursued. Iran's position, as demonstrated, is not aligned with those objectives. That creates a fixed boundary. Now place all three together again. China proposes a process-based framework. The United States maintains outcome-based demands. Iran rejects those demands. Three positions, no overlap. We have seen this exact dynamic before. The result is not immediate escalation. It is prolonged stalemate, punctuated by attempts to reopen dialogue that return to the same structural constraints. Let me be very precise about this. The structure does not require any actor to change its position in order to persist. Each actor can continue operating within its current logic without immediate contradiction. That is what makes it stable in the short term. But stability at this level is not resolution. It is the absence of resolution. And this is where the structural pool becomes visible. China's continued diplomatic engagement, the 26 calls, the proposal, the positioning, indicates an effort to prevent the negotiation space from collapsing entirely. Washington's continued insistence on its demands indicates a commitment to a defined end state. Iran's rejection indicates a refusal to accept that end state. None of these positions, as they currently stand, create convergence. Structure determines outcomes long before decisions are visible. That is the line to hold here, because what we are observing is not a failure of diplomacy in a single moment. It is the interaction of three structured positions that do not align. Now consider what a de-escalatory path would require within this framework. It would require either a shift in Washington's demands, a shift in Iran's rejection of those demands, or the emergence of a framework that both sides accept as a basis for negotiation. China's proposal attempts to create that third option. It reframes the discussion around principles rather than outcomes. But the evidence shows that this reframing has not been accepted by Washington. That is the critical point. Without acceptance by all primary actors, a framework remains a proposal. It does not become a process. And this brings us to the final structural observation. The presence of a proposal, the acknowledgement of China's influence, the denial of military support claims, the ongoing diplomatic outreach, and the preparation for a high-level summit, all of these elements exist simultaneously. They create movement, they create activity, they create the appearance of engagement, but they do not, by themselves, create alignment. Alignment requires a shared definition of acceptable outcomes, or at least a shared willingness to negotiate toward them. At this moment, the evidence shows that such a shared definition does not exist. The system is active, the actors are engaged, the channels are open, but the structure remains unchanged. And in systems like this, unchanged structure produces repeated outcomes. The same positions return, the same constraints apply, the same gaps remain. The proposal exists, the response is absent, the positions hold. The question that remains is not whether a framework has been offered. It is whether any actor is prepared to adjust the position that makes that framework necessary.